the autumn of 1982, a 23-year-old factory worker named Daniel Reeves left his shift at the textile mill in Asheville, North Carolina, and never made it home. His pickup truck was found 3 days later on a logging road near the Pisgah National Forest, keys still in the ignition, wallet on the dashboard. For 39 years, investigators believed Daniel had simply walked into those mountains and disappeared. Another young man lost to bad decisions or worse luck. But in 2021, advanced DNA analysis of a single hair follicle found trapped in the truck's door seal revealed something that would shatter that assumption and expose a betrayal so profound that it would shake the entire community. The person responsible wasn't a stranger lurking in those dark woods. It was someone Daniel had trusted completely, someone who had helped search for him, someone who had comforted his grieving mother for nearly 4 decades. What makes this case truly haunting isn't just the decades of lies. It's how close the truth had been all along, waiting in an evidence box that nobody thought to reopen until a determined cold case detective refused to accept the obvious answer. If you're interested in true crime cases that prove justice can still find its way home, let us know where you're watching from in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss our next investigation. The mountains of western North Carolina in 1982 were still wild enough to swallow a person whole. Asheville sat in a valley surrounded by the Blue Ridge Peaks, a city caught between the old textile economy that was dying and the tourist economy that hadn't quite arrived yet. The air smelled like wood smoke and wet leaves, that particular scent of autumn in the high country where the temperature dropped fast once the sun went down. People still left their doors unlocked. The radio played Willie Nelson and news about the recession, about interest rates at 15%, about factories closing across the South. The streets downtown still had that worn-in feeling, red brick buildings from the 1920s mixed with newer storefronts, everything moving at the pace of a medium-sized mountain town where everybody knew somebody who knew everybody else. On Saturday mornings, the farmers' market filled Pack Square with the smell of apple cider and fresh bread. On Sunday evenings, families walked along the riverside park throwing bread to the ducks. Daniel Reeves had lived in Asheville his entire 23 years, born at Mission Hospital on a hot August night in 1959, raised in the Montford neighborhood where the old Victorian houses lined the streets like sentinels from another era. He'd gone to Lee Edwards High School, played junior varsity basketball, though he wasn't particularly good at it, graduated in 1977 with a C average and no clear plan for what came next. He'd tried community college for a semester, taking general education classes at Asheville Buncombe Technical College, but it didn't stick. The classroom felt constraining. He was better with his hands, better with concrete problems that had mechanical solutions. So he got a job at Beacon Manufacturing, one of the big textile mills that employed half the county, working the second shift alongside 200 other people feeding cloth through the massive looms that ran 24 hours a day. The work was loud and hot, standing at the looms for 8 hours, while cotton thread screamed through the machines at speeds that could take your finger off if you weren't careful. The noise was constant, a mechanical roar that left your ears ringing for hours after the shift ended. The air was humid and full of cotton lint that stuck to your clothes and hair, but it paid $9 an hour, which was decent money in 1982, especially for someone with just a high school diploma. Daniel was saving up. He had a plan, the kind of long-term goal that kept him going through the monotonous shifts. He wanted to open an auto repair shop, something small, maybe just 2 bays to start, somewhere on the south side of town where rent was cheaper. He was good with engines, the kind of person who could diagnose a problem just by listening to the sound a motor made. He understood how things fit together, how systems worked, how to trace a problem back to its source. On weekends, He'd help friends fix their cars, charging just enough to cover parts. He had a reputation in the neighborhood as someone reliable, someone who did quality work and didn't try to overcharge. People trusted him. That meant something in a place like Asheville, where trust was currency and reputation was everything. He kept a notebook where he tracked his savings, wrote down ideas for the shop, what equipment he'd need, what he'd call it, how he'd advertise. He'd gotten up to $3,400 saved, keeping it in a coffee can in his closet because he didn't trust banks after seeing what the recession had done to some people's accounts. At his current rate, saving about $200 a month after rent and expenses, he figured he'd have enough for a down payment on a building in about 3 years, maybe 4. He lived with his mother, Patricia Reeves, in a small 2-bedroom house on Depot Street in the Montford neighborhood, a clapboard house painted pale yellow, with a porch that sagged slightly on one side. His father, James Reeves, had died when Daniel was 12. Massive heart attack at 41, while mowing the lawn on a Saturday afternoon in July 1971. 1 minute, he was pushing the Toro across the front yard. The next, he was on the ground, gone before the ambulance arrived. After that, it was just Daniel and Patricia, the two of them figuring out how to keep going. She worked as a seamstress at Beacon Manufacturing, same company, but different building, day shift sewing room, where she operated an industrial Singer machine that could run through denim like it was paper. Her fingers were always marked with needle pricks, small calluses on her fingertips from handling fabric 40 hours a week. They had a routine that had calcified over the years into something neither of them thought about anymore. She'd leave for work at 6 in the morning, walking the 8 blocks to the mill, because the car, a 1974 Dodge Dart, was Daniel's to use for his evening shifts. He'd sleep until noon, having gotten home from work after midnight, then wake up to an empty house that still smelled like her morning coffee. He'd make himself lunch, usually a sandwich, sometimes eggs if there were any left, then spend the afternoon working on his truck or watching television or reading car magazines. Auto Week, Motor Trend, Hot Rod, stacks of them piling up in his room. At 2:30, Patricia would come home, tired, smelling like machine oil and cotton dust, and they'd have maybe 45 minutes together at the kitchen table before he had to leave for his own shift. Those 45 minutes were their time. She'd tell him about her day, about which machines had broken down, about the supervisor who everyone hated because she timed their bathroom breaks. He'd tell her about his plans for the repair shop, show her sketches he'd drawn, ask her opinion on whether he should specialize in American cars or work on everything. She'd listen, offer thoughts, remind him to be patient, that good things took time. She was 53 years old in 1982, looked older because life had been hard, because working in the mill aged you faster than office work ever did. Her hair had gone gray early. Her hands were rough. But she had a gentle way about her, a quietness that came from understanding loss and learning to carry it without complaint. She'd raised Daniel alone after James died, worked double shifts when she had to, made sure he had what he needed even if she went without. Daniel knew what she'd sacrificed for him. He didn't talk about it much, but he knew. The repair shop wasn't just about his own dreams. It was about getting to a place where he could help her, where she could quit the mill, where she wouldn't have to spend her 60s bent over a sewing machine breathing cotton lint. On Thursday, October 14th, 1982, that routine played out like it had 1,000 times before. The morning had been cold, frost on the grass, the kind of sharp autumn chill that came down from the mountains and settled in the valley overnight. Patricia had left for work before sunrise, walking through the blue darkness with her lunch pail and thermos, her breath visible in the cold air. Daniel woke around noon to sunlight streaming through his bedroom window. The house was quiet, except for the tick of the heating pipes warming up. He made coffee in the percolator on the stove, standing in the kitchen in his t-shirt and jeans, staring out the window at the neighbor's dog digging in their yard. The coffee smelled bitter and strong, the way his mother always made it. He spent the morning under the hood of his truck, parked in the driveway, replacing a worn belt that had been squealing for 2 weeks. The work was meditative, his hands moving through familiar motions, the October sun warm on his shoulders, even though the air stayed cool. A neighbor walking past called out a greeting, and Daniel waved back, motor oil on his fingers, leaving dark smears on his jeans. Around 1 in the afternoon, he went back inside, washed his hands with the orange pumice soap they kept by the kitchen sink, and made himself a bologna sandwich. White bread, yellow mustard, 3 slices of bologna. He ate standing at the counter, listening to the radio, a country station playing Waylon Jennings. Patricia came home at 2:30, exactly on schedule. She looked tired, the way she always did after 8 hours on the factory floor, her shoulders slightly hunched from the repetitive motion of feeding fabric through the machine. She set her lunch pail on the counter and poured herself what was left of the coffee, even though it had been sitting on the burner for hours and had gotten thick and bitter. They sat at the kitchen table, the same yellow Formica table they'd had since Daniel was a kid, cigarette burns on one edge from where his father used to set his Marlboros. Patricia ate leftover meatloaf straight from the refrigerator, too tired to heat it up. Daniel told her he'd fixed the truck belt, mentioned he might stop by Marcus's house after his shift to look at the carburetor on Marcus's Chevy. She nodded, said okay, but don't stay out too late. It was a weeknight, and he needed his sleep. He remembers standing up from the table, carrying his plate to the sink, rinsing it under cold water. He remembers checking his pockets for his wallet, his keys, the employee badge he needed to clock in at the mill. He remembers his mother saying something about picking up milk on his way home tomorrow. They were almost out. He said he would. Then he walked to where she sat at the table and kissed her cheek, something he'd done every day since he was little, a ritual neither of them thought about, but both maintained. Her skin was soft and smelled like the rose hand cream she used to keep her hands from cracking. She patted his arm, said, "Be careful," and he said he always was. He walked out the front door into the afternoon light. The temperature had risen into the 60s, pleasant October weather, leaves starting to turn on the oak trees that lined the street. His truck, the 1975 Ford F-150 he'd bought 2 years ago for $800, was parked in the driveway. Blue paint faded in spots, some rust forming on the rear fender, but it ran well, and that's what mattered. He climbed in, turned the key, listened to the engine catch and settle into its familiar idle. The radio came on, tuned to the same country station he'd been listening to earlier. He backed out of the driveway, shifted into drive, and pulled away down Depot Street. Patricia watched through the kitchen window as his truck turned at the corner and disappeared behind the neighbor's hedge. That was the last time she saw her son alive. The drive to Beacon Manufacturing took about 12 minutes from the house. Daniel knew every turn, every pothole, could have driven it in his sleep. Down Montfort Avenue past the old Victorian houses, left on Broadway, right on Southside Avenue, where the road narrowed and the neighborhood got more industrial. The mill sat on the eastern edge of town, a sprawling brick complex that covered 3 city blocks, steam stacks rising above the buildings, visible from miles away. Daniel parked in the employee lot, a cracked asphalt expanse that held 200 cars during shift change. He walked to the east entrance, showed his badge to the security guard, and clocked in at the time clock by the stairs. The punch card clicked into place. 2:58 p.m. He climbed the metal stairs to the second floor, walked through the corridor where the noise started to build, that mechanical roar of the looms running at full speed, and found his station. His supervisor, Carl Henderson, was there checking the production numbers from the day shift. Henderson was 50-something, thick around the middle, had worked at Beacon for 30 years, and would work there another 8 before the mill closed in 1990. He nodded at Daniel, said the usual things about quotas and keeping the line moving, and Daniel nodded back and got to work. The second shift at Beacon Manufacturing ran from 3 in the afternoon until 11:30 at night, 8.5 hours with a 30-minute dinner break at 7. Daniel worked Station 14, a Draper X3 loom that wove cotton thread into cloth for sheets and pillowcases, running at 180 picks per minute, the shuttle flying back and forth so fast it was just a blur. The noise was incredible, a metallic screaming that made conversation impossible. Workers communicated through hand signals, through gestures, through simply knowing what needed to happen without having to say it. Daniel stood at his station, feet planted on the concrete floor, eyes watching the thread for breaks or snags. When the thread broke, you had maybe 30 seconds to tie it back before the fabric developed a flaw that would have to be cut out later. The work required constant attention, a kind of meditative focus where you stopped thinking about anything except the thread and the shuttle and the rhythm of the machine. Around him, the factory floor stretched in all directions, rows of looms running in parallel, 200 machines creating a symphony of industrial noise that never stopped, day or night, week after week. The lighting was harsh fluorescent tubes hanging from the high ceiling, casting everything in a flat white light that washed out colors and made it hard to judge time. Inside the mill, 7 p.m. looked the same as 3 a.m., the same endless present of machines and noise and work. Daniel had worked at Beacon for 5 years now. He knew most of the people on his shift, though the turnover was high. People came and went, lasted a few months or a few years, moved on to other jobs or other towns. The ones who stayed were the ones who needed the paycheck badly enough to endure the monotony, the noise, the way the work got into your bones, and stayed there. His co-workers on the second shift, second floor, were a mix of ages and backgrounds. Mary Sutton, 42, worked the station next to his, had 3 kids at home and a husband who drank too much. Tommy Pratt, 19, fresh out of high school, working to save money for trade school. Gerald Morrison, 61, had been at Beacon since 1948, remembered when things were different, when the mills ran the whole town and everyone knew they'd have work until they retired. None of them noticed anything unusual about Daniel that night. He worked his station, took his break at 7, ate the sandwich he'd brought from home sitting at one of the metal picnic tables in the break room. He drank coffee from the vending machine, bitter and watery, but hot. He didn't talk much, but that was normal for Daniel. He was friendly, but quiet, the kind of person who'd help you if you asked, but didn't volunteer much about himself. During his break, sometime around 7:15, he used the payphone mounted on the wall near the vending machines. He fed in a quarter, dialed a number, waited. Someone later reconstructed this moment from phone records, traced the call, verified the duration. 3 minutes talking to Marcus Webb, making plans to stop by after the shift ended, just like he'd told his mother he might. At 7:30, the break was over. Daniel threw away his sandwich wrapper, poured out the last of his coffee, and walked back upstairs to his station. 4 more hours of work. The thread running, the shuttle flying, the noise, the heat, the familiar rhythm of a job he'd done 1,000 times before. The shift ended at 11:30. When the final whistle blew, a harsh blast that cut through even the roar of the machines. Daniel shut down his loom, cleaned his station the way everyone was required to do, and walked with the crowd toward the east exit. 200 workers filtering through the corridors, moving in a tired shuffle toward the time clock, toward their cars, toward home. Daniel punched out at 11:34 p.m. The time clock stamped his card with mechanical precision. He walked through the exit where Thomas Sullivan, the night security guard, sat in a small booth near the gate. Sullivan was 68, retired from the post office, working security to supplement his pension. He waved at workers as they left, knew most of them by face, if not by name. Sullivan specifically remembered Daniel that night. Later, when police interviewed him, Sullivan could picture it clearly. Daniel walking through the gate, hands in his jacket pockets, heading toward his truck. And Sullivan noticed something he meant to mention next time he saw the kid. The right taillight was out. Bulb probably burned out. Should get that fixed before a cop pulled him over for it. Sullivan watched Daniel climb into the blue F-150, saw the backup lights come on as Daniel put it in reverse, watched the truck pull out of the lot and turn left onto Sweeten Creek Road, heading north toward the Biltmore Forest area, toward where Marcus Webb lived. The time was approximately 11:36 p.m., and that was the last confirmed sighting of Daniel Reeves alive. Around the same time, Marcus Webb was at home on Long Shoals Road. The house was a small rental cottage, wood frame with vinyl siding, set back from the road with a gravel driveway. Marcus and his fiancée, Lynn Carter, were in the living room. Lynn worked as a receptionist at a dental office downtown, had the evening off, was wearing sweatpants and one of Marcus's old t-shirts. They'd eaten dinner around 6, leftover spaghetti, then settled in to watch television. The TV played some sitcom, one of those Thursday night shows that everyone watched. The volume was low. They weren't really paying attention, just letting the time pass in that comfortable way couples do when they've been together long enough that they don't need constant entertainment. Marcus was thinking about the wedding, now 6 months away, April 1983. Lynn was thinking about whether she needed to do laundry before Friday. The phone rang at 8 o'clock. Marcus answered, heard Daniel's voice on the other end, the noise of the factory floor in the background. Daniel asked if he could stop by after work, wanted to look at the carburetor issue on Marcus's Chevy. They'd been meaning to fix it for weeks. The car kept stalling out when you gave it gas. Classic carburetor problem. Marcus said sure. Come by when you get off work. He'd be up. They talked for another minute or two. Nothing important, just making plans. Marcus hung up and told Lynn that Daniel was coming by later. Lynn barely reacted. She was used to this. Marcus and Daniel working on cars at odd hours, disappearing into the garage for half the night. She didn't mind. Marcus liked having projects, and Daniel was good company. She liked Daniel. He was quiet, polite, always asked how she was doing when he came over. She and Marcus went back to watching television. Sometime around 9:30, Lynn said she was getting tired, might head to bed early. Marcus said he'd stay up and wait for Daniel. She kissed him goodnight and went into the bedroom. She remembers hearing the television still playing when she fell asleep. Remembers Marcus was on the couch in the living room. What happened in the next few hours would become the subject of intense scrutiny 39 years later. But at the time, it seemed unremarkable. Just another Thursday night in October 1982. Two friends making plans to work on a car. Nothing unusual. Nothing to suggest that by morning, one of them would be dead and the other would be starting a lie that would last nearly 4 decades. Marcus Webb's house was about 20 minutes from the mill, a rental cottage on a dirt road off Long Shoals Road. To get there from Beacon Manufacturing, you took Sweeten Creek to Hendersonville Road, then cut through the back roads past the Biltmore estate. It was a route Daniel had driven dozens of times. But Daniel Reeves never arrived at Marcus Webb's house that night. Marcus waited until 1 in the morning, then called the Reeves house. No answer. Patricia was asleep. Marcus figured maybe Daniel had changed his mind, gone home instead, decided he was too tired. It happened sometimes. Marcus went to bed. Friday morning, Patricia Reeves woke up at 6 and walked down the hall to Daniel's room. His bed was empty, still made from the day before. His work clothes from the previous day were gone. She felt the first flutter of worry, but pushed it down. Maybe he'd fallen asleep at Marcus's house. Maybe the car work had taken longer than expected. She called Marcus around 7. Marcus picked up, groggy. "No," he said. "Daniel never showed up last night." Patricia felt the worry deepen. She called the mill. Had Daniel clocked out? Yes, at 11:34. She called the hospital. No accidents reported. By noon, she was standing in the lobby of the Asheville Police Department, filling out a missing person report. The officer who took her statement was Detective Raymond Foster, a 15-year veteran who had seen his share of missing persons cases. Most of them, especially young men, turned up within 48 hours. They'd gotten drunk, crashed at a friend's place, forgot to call home. Foster took down the details. Daniel Reeves, 23, white male, 5'10", 165 pounds, brown hair, last seen leaving Beacon Manufacturing, driving a 1975 Ford F-150, blue with some rust on the fender, license plate NCJ 4721. Foster told Patricia they'd start looking, but not to panic yet. Young men sometimes needed space, sometimes had personal issues they were working through. Patricia insisted that wasn't Daniel. He wouldn't just disappear without calling. He wouldn't do that to her. Foster wrote it all down, assured her they'd investigate, and filed the report. By Friday evening, there was still no sign of Daniel. Patricia called everyone she could think of, his co-workers, his friends from high school, distant relatives. Nobody had seen him. Marcus Webb drove the route from the mill to his house twice, looking for any sign of the truck, any indication of where Daniel might have gone. Nothing. Saturday morning, Detective Foster began making calls. He checked with the highway patrol, with surrounding counties, with the hospitals again. No accidents, no arrests, no John Does matching Daniel's description. The truck hadn't been spotted. Foster started to think, maybe this wasn't just a kid needing space. On Sunday afternoon, 3 days after Daniel disappeared, a hiker named Jennifer Adams was walking the logging trails near the Pisgah National Forest, about 15 miles south of Asheville. The trails back there were popular with locals, winding through dense woods where the autumn leaves were turning gold and red. Jennifer was walking her dog, a German shepherd named Ranger, when the dog started barking at something off the trail. She followed the dog about 30 yards into the woods and found a pickup truck parked on an old logging road, nearly hidden by brush. Blue Ford F-150, rust on the fender. The driver's door was open. Jennifer approached carefully and looked inside. The keys were in the ignition, turned to the off position. A wallet sat on the dashboard, leather, worn at the edges. She opened it and found a driver's license. Daniel Reeves. She ran back to her car and drove until she found a gas station with a payphone. The Buncombe County Sheriff's Department responded first, since the location was outside Asheville city limits. Deputies secured the scene, called in the detectives, and within 2 hours, Detective Raymond Foster was standing in those woods, looking at Daniel Reeves's empty truck. The scene was strange in ways that bothered Foster even then, before he knew what he was looking at. The wallet contained $43 in cash, 3 5s and 28 1s, folded neatly. Daniel's driver's license was there, issued in 1980, showing a younger version of him with shorter hair and a hesitant smile. There was a business card from an auto parts store, a receipt from a gas station dated 3 days earlier, a photo of Patricia that looked like it had been taken at least 10 years ago. Daniel's work jacket was folded on the passenger seat, the Beacon manufacturing jacket with his name stitched over the pocket. The fold was neat, careful, like someone had placed it there deliberately rather than tossing it aside. A thermos of coffee sat in the cup holder, the kind with a red plaid pattern that was popular then. Foster unscrewed the cap and sniffed. Still smelled like coffee, though it had gone cold. He estimated it was about half full. The radio was off, knob turned all the way to the left. The keys were in the ignition, turned to the off position. The gear shift was in park. Everything suggested someone had parked here normally, methodically, going through the usual sequence of actions you'd take when you arrived somewhere. Turn off the radio, turn off the engine, put it in park, set the brake. But the driver's door was open. Not just unlocked, but standing open, hinges creaking slightly in the wind that moved through the trees. And that struck Foster as wrong. If someone had parked here intentionally, planning to walk into the woods for whatever reason, why leave the door open? You'd close it, lock it maybe, protect your vehicle from weather and animals and thieves. Unless you'd gotten out in a hurry, unless something had interrupted the normal sequence of parking, unless you'd been pulled from the vehicle before you could complete that final action of closing the door. Foster walked around the truck, examining the exterior. No new dents or scrapes. No damage to the paint. The tires were intact, holding air. The tailgate was closed and latched. The only thing notable was the broken taillight on the right side, the one Sullivan had mentioned seeing, the plastic lens cracked and the bulb visible. He knelt down and looked at the ground. The soil here was soft from the rain they'd had 2 days earlier, and he could see the tire tracks clearly where the F-150 had pulled off the main logging road onto this smaller spur. The tracks were clean, straight, no indication of skidding or swerving. Whoever had driven here had done so carefully, normally, and there were footprints. Foster called over one of the deputies and they examined them together. Boots, definitely boots, probably size 10 or 11 based on the length. The tread pattern was a common work boot style, nothing distinctive. The prints led away from the driver's door into the woods, heading roughly southwest. They followed the prints about 50 yards before they reached a rockier area where the ground was too hard to hold impressions. The prints just stopped, vanished, leaving no indication of where the person had gone from there. Foster marked the last visible print with a small orange flag, then stood and looked around. They were deep in the forest now, surrounded by oaks and maples and pine trees, the canopy overhead filtering the afternoon sunlight into a green-tinted dimness. The ground was covered with leaves, layer upon layer of autumn fall, creating a carpet several inches thick. You could walk through here and leave almost no trace, especially if you knew what you were doing. Foster organized the search methodically. He had the deputies create a grid, marking it out with string and stakes, dividing the forest into sections 50 feet square. They'd search each section systematically, walking shoulder to shoulder, looking for anything, any sign that Daniel had been here. The search went on for 3 days, from Monday through Wednesday. They brought in volunteers from the community, eventually numbering close to 40 people at the peak. They expanded the search radius to 5 square miles, covering a vast area of the Pisgah National Forest. They used cadaver dogs, German shepherds trained to detect decomposition. They checked ravines and stream beds, old mine shafts and caves, anywhere a body might have been hidden or fallen. They found nothing. No clothing, no blood, no disturbed earth that might indicate a burial site. The dogs alerted twice, but both times it turned out to be dead deer, animals that had died naturally and been left to decompose. By Thursday, the search was called off. They'd covered everything they could reasonably cover, and there was simply no evidence that Daniel Reeves had died in these woods, which left Foster with a puzzle. The truck was here. The footprints suggested someone had walked into the forest. But where had they gone? And more importantly, was it Daniel who'd walked away, or someone else? Foster's investigation became more methodical, more procedural. He interviewed everyone in Daniel's life, building a timeline of the last day, looking for any indication of what might have happened after 11:36 p.m. when the truck left the mill. He interviewed Daniel's co-workers at Beacon Manufacturing. Everyone told the same story. Normal shift, nothing unusual. Daniel seemed fine. Carl Henderson, the supervisor, said Daniel had hit his production quota, no issues with the quality of his work. Mary Sutton, who worked the next station, said she'd waved goodbye to Daniel as they were leaving. He'd waved back, looked tired, but not upset or worried. Foster interviewed Thomas Sullivan, the security guard, multiple times. Sullivan was consistent. He'd seen Daniel's truck leave at 11:36, watched it turn left onto Sweeten Creek Road, heading north toward Biltmore Forest. He hadn't seen any other vehicles leave immediately after, though he admitted there was a period of about 5 or 10 minutes where he'd gone into the guard shack to use the bathroom and wouldn't have seen if another vehicle left during that time. Foster checked on that, had deputies review the time cards from that night, looking for anyone else who'd left around the same time as Daniel. There were 3 other people who'd clocked out between 11:30 and 11:45. 2 were women who carpooled together, both of whom Foster interviewed. They'd driven straight home, hadn't seen Daniel's truck on the road. The third was a man named Robert Chen, who drove a Honda Civic and lived in the opposite direction from the Biltmore area. Foster checked his story, verified it with his wife, who confirmed he'd come home at the normal time. The interviews with Marcus Webb and Lynn Carter were more extensive. Foster spent several hours with them over multiple sessions, going over the evening again and again, looking for any inconsistency or detail that might matter. Marcus's story never changed. Daniel had called at 8, said he'd come by after work. Marcus had waited until 1 in the morning, then called the Reeves house, got no answer, figured Daniel had changed his mind. Went to bed. Woke up Friday morning to Patricia's call asking if he'd seen Daniel. Foster asked about Marcus's movements that night. Marcus said he'd been home all evening with Lynn. They'd watched television until she went to bed around 9:30. He'd stayed up, dozing on the couch, woke up periodically to check the time. Finally gave up around 1 when Daniel still hadn't shown up. Lynn confirmed all of this. She and Marcus had been home together. She'd gone to bed early, fallen asleep quickly, hadn't heard anything unusual during the night. Marcus had been on the couch when she went to bed and was in bed next to her when she woke up in the morning. Foster asked if he could see Marcus's car, the 1970 Chevy Nova they'd supposedly been planning to work on. Marcus showed him. Primer gray, sitting in the garage, carburetor parts spread out on a workbench. Foster looked it over, saw nothing suspicious. He asked if he could check the mileage, compare it to what Marcus usually drove. Marcus said, sure. He drove maybe 50 miles a week, usually just back and forth to work at the garage where he was employed. Foster wrote down the odometer reading, thought about following up on it, but never did. There was no reason to suspect Marcus of anything. The investigation expanded to other possibilities. Foster checked Daniel's financial records, looking for any indication he might have been planning to leave town. Daniel's bank account at First Citizens had $247 in it. No recent large withdrawals. Patricia told Foster about the coffee can in Daniel's closet where he kept his savings, showed it to him. $3,400 in cash, mostly 20s and 10s, exactly where it should be. If Daniel had planned to run away, he hadn't taken his money. Foster looked into whether Daniel might have been involved in anything illegal that could have led to violence. Drugs were the obvious concern. He talked to vice detectives, asked if Daniel's name had ever come up in any investigations. Nothing. He checked with the narcotics unit at the sheriff's department. No record of Daniel Reeves in any of their files. He investigated whether there were any romantic entanglements that might have caused problems. Patricia said Daniel didn't have a girlfriend currently, hadn't dated anyone seriously in over a year. Foster checked anyway, found an ex-girlfriend named Stephanie Morris, who'd moved to Charlotte 6 months earlier. He called her, asked if she'd had any recent contact with Daniel. She said no. They'd parted on good terms. She was seeing someone new. Hadn't talked to Daniel in months. Foster checked whether Daniel had any debts, anyone he owed money to who might have come looking for him. Nothing. Patricia said Daniel was careful with money, paid his bills on time, didn't gamble, didn't have credit cards. Foster verified it all, found no red flags. Every avenue led nowhere. Every theory had holes. The voluntary disappearance theory didn't make sense because Daniel hadn't taken his money and had no apparent reason to leave. The suicide theory didn't make sense because there was no body and no indication Daniel had been depressed. The murder theory didn't make sense because there was no suspect, no motive, no evidence of violence. Foster's case file grew to over 200 pages of reports, interviews, and dead ends. By Christmas 1982, 3 months after Daniel disappeared, the investigation had exhausted all leads. Foster wrote in his notes, "Case remains unsolved. No evidence of foul play beyond the unexplained abandonment of vehicle. No body recovered despite extensive search. Subject may have walked away from vehicle and died in the forest from exposure or accident, but body not found. Case classified as missing person, presumed deceased. Active investigation suspended pending new evidence." Patricia Reeves never stopped looking. She became the kind of mother you'd see on the news sometimes, the ones who spent decades searching for missing children, who never gave up hope no matter how much time passed. She put up flyers all over Asheville, stapling them to telephone poles, taping them in store windows, leaving stacks of them at gas stations and restaurants. Daniel's face became familiar to people who'd never met him. The photo from his high school graduation reprinted 1,000 times. The text underneath asking anyone with information to call the Asheville Police Department. She called Detective Foster every week for the first year, then every month after that, asking if there were any updates, any new leads, anything at all. Foster was always kind to her, always patient, but the answer was always the same. No new information. The case remained open, but there was nothing to investigate, no direction to go. She drove out to the Pisgah National Forest where the truck had been found, must have made that trip 50 times or more over the years. She'd park at the logging road, walk into the woods, call Daniel's name even though she knew it was futile. She'd stand among the trees and feel the weight of his absence, the terrible not knowing that was worse than any certain grief. She talked to psychics, a handful of them over the years, people who claimed they could sense where Daniel was, whether he was alive or dead. They all told her different things. One said he was alive in California. Another said he'd been murdered and buried near water. A third said his spirit was at peace and she should let go. None of them were right. None of them knew anything real. Marcus Webb helped her, especially in those first years. He'd take time off work to drive around with her, stopping at truck stops and diners, showing Daniel's photo to strangers, asking if anyone had seen him. They'd post flyers together, spend entire Saturdays covering the towns around Asheville, Hendersonville, and Brevard and Black Mountain, anywhere Daniel might have gone. Patricia was grateful for Marcus's help. She told him so many times, thanked him for being such a good friend to Daniel, for not giving up the way other people had. Marcus would shake his head, say it was nothing, say Daniel was his brother in all the ways that mattered, say he'd keep looking until they found answers. On Daniel's birthday every year, Patricia would bake a cake, the chocolate cake with peanut butter frosting that had been his favorite. She'd set a place for him at the table, light a candle, sit alone in the kitchen and sing happy birthday quietly to herself. The neighbors thought she was losing her mind, but she didn't care. It was her ritual, her way of keeping Daniel present in the world, even though the world seemed determined to forget him. The years accumulated. 1983 became 1984, became 1985. The mill changed ownership, then changed again. Patricia kept working there because she needed the money and didn't know what else to do. But the work got harder as she got older, her hands less steady, her back complaining about the long hours bent over the sewing machine. She attended Marcus and Lynn's wedding in April 1983, 6 months after Daniel disappeared. She sat in the church and watched Marcus stand at the altar in a rented tuxedo, watched Lynn walk down the aisle in white, and felt the absence of her son like a physical pain. Daniel should have been the best man, should have been standing next to Marcus, should have been there to celebrate his friend's happiness. But the spot where he would have stood was filled by someone else, Marcus's cousin from Charlotte, and Patricia sat in the pew and quietly cried. In 2003, Detective Raymond Foster retired. Before he left, he went through his old cases one last time, including Daniel Reeves. He wrote a final note in the file. No evidence of foul play, presumed voluntary disappearance or death by misadventure in the Pisgah Forest. Case remains open, but inactive. For 18 more years, the case sat untouched. Then, in 2021, the Asheville Police Department received a grant to reopen cold cases using new DNA technology. A detective named Sarah Chen was assigned to the cold case unit. Chen was 34, methodical, and had a reputation for not accepting easy answers. She'd grown up in Asheville and remembered hearing about the Daniel Reeves case when she was a kid, the story of the young man who'd vanished into the forest. Chen started pulling old files, looking for cases where DNA evidence had been collected but never properly analyzed. The Reeves case came up. She ordered the evidence box from storage. The box arrived in March 2021, sealed with evidence tape from 1982. Chen opened it in the department's evidence room and laid out the contents: the wallet, the work jacket, the thermos, bags of trace evidence. And there, at the bottom, a small envelope containing 3 human hairs collected from the truck's interior. In 1982, DNA analysis wasn't available. The hairs had been collected and stored, just in case technology improved. Now, 39 years later, Chen sent them to a private lab that specialized in degraded DNA samples. 6 weeks later, the results came back. 2 of the hairs belonged to Daniel Reeves. The lab had compared them against a DNA sample Patricia had provided years ago when the state started building a database for missing persons cases. The 3rd hair was different. It belonged to someone else. Male. The DNA profile was entered into CODIS, the national database. No match. Whoever this hair belonged to had never been arrested, never had their DNA collected. But Chen had another idea. She uploaded the DNA profile to GEDmatch, a public genealogy database where people uploaded their own DNA results to find relatives. It was the same technique that had been used to catch the Golden State Killer. 3 weeks later, GEDmatch found a match. A distant cousin, someone who'd uploaded their DNA hoping to find family history. The lab worked backward, building a family tree, narrowing down the possibilities. By July 2021, they had a name: Marcus Webb. Chen sat in her office, staring at the name on the screen. Marcus Webb, Daniel's best friend. The person who'd reported him missing. The person who'd helped search for him. The person who'd comforted Patricia for 39 years. Chen pulled Marcus Webb's current information. He was 63 now, living in Charlotte, working as a manager at an auto parts store, married to Lynn, the same woman he'd been engaged to in 1982. 2 grown children. Chen started building the case. She needed more than a single hair. She needed motive, opportunity, evidence of what actually happened that night. She went back to the original case file and read every word. Something caught her attention in Marcus's original statement. He'd said Daniel called from the payphone at the mill during his dinner break, around 8. But Daniel's shift ended at 11:30. Why call 4 hours early to make plans? Why not just call from a payphone closer to Marcus's house? Chen checked the phone records from 1982. They were on microfiche, archived in the county clerk's office. She spent a day going through them. There it was. A call from the Beacon Manufacturing payphone to Marcus Webb's number at 8:03 p.m. on October 14, 1982. Duration, 3 minutes. But there was another call. At 11:47 p.m., just 13 minutes after Daniel clocked out, there was a 2-minute call from the same payphone to Marcus Webb's number. Chen felt her pulse quicken. Marcus had never mentioned a second call. Why not? She kept digging. She found the original witness statements from 1982. Thomas Sullivan, the security guard, had seen Daniel's truck leave at 11:34. But Sullivan had also mentioned something else, something that wasn't followed up on at the time. He'd seen another vehicle leave about 10 minutes later. A Chevy, older model, primer gray. Sullivan hadn't thought anything of it at the time. Chen found Marcus Webb's vehicle registration from 1982. He owned a 1970 Chevrolet Nova, primer gray, the same car he and Daniel had supposedly been working on. Chen built a timeline. Daniel leaves the mill at 11:34. At 11:47, someone makes a call from the mill payphone to Marcus's house. 13 minutes. Time for Daniel to realize something's wrong, to try to call for help, or time for someone else to use that phone after Daniel is already gone. She looked at the route Daniel would have taken. From the mill to Marcus's house, you'd normally take Hendersonville Road, but the logging road where the truck was found was off that route, several miles south. Why would Daniel go there? Unless he didn't drive there himself. Unless someone else drove his truck there after he was already dead. Chen knew she needed more. She needed Marcus Webb's DNA, collected legally. She needed evidence that would hold up in court. She coordinated with the Charlotte Police Department and set up surveillance on Marcus Webb. For 2 weeks in August 2021, detectives watched Marcus. They followed him to work, watched him eat lunch, observed his routine. On August 19th, Marcus stopped at a coffee shop. After he left, detectives went in and retrieved the paper cup he'd used. The DNA from the saliva on that cup was tested. Perfect match to the hair found in Daniel Reeves's truck. On September 3rd, 2021, Charlotte police arrested Marcus Webb at his home. He was 63 years old, gray-haired, wearing reading glasses. When the officers told him he was being charged with the murder of Daniel Reeves, his face went pale. The interrogation lasted 6 hours. At first, Marcus denied everything. He hadn't seen Daniel that night. He didn't know how his hair got in the truck. It must have been from an earlier time, from all the times he'd ridden in Daniel's truck over the years. But Chen had done her homework. She laid out the phone records. The second call, the one Marcus never mentioned. She showed him the evidence of his car leaving the mill 10 minutes after Daniel. She explained about the logging road, how it wasn't on the route Daniel would have taken. And then she told Marcus about Lynn Carter. Chen had interviewed Lynn, now Lynn Webb, earlier that day. And Lynn had finally, after 39 years, told the truth. Marcus started crying. The story came out in pieces over the next hour. Lynn Carter had been cheating on Marcus in 1982. She'd been having an affair with someone from work, and Marcus had found out in early October. He'd been devastated, humiliated, angry. But he'd convinced Lynn to end it, to commit to their engagement, to make the wedding happen. But there was a problem. Daniel knew about the affair. Lynn had confided in Daniel before everything blew up. She trusted him, considered him a friend. After Marcus found out, Lynn had told Marcus that Daniel knew. Marcus became obsessed with the idea that Daniel would tell everyone, that Daniel would ruin his reputation, destroy his relationship, make him look like a fool. Marcus's pride couldn't handle it. He started thinking about ways to solve the problem. On October 14th, Daniel had called at 8, just like Marcus told the police. They made plans for Daniel to come by after work. But Marcus didn't wait at home. He drove to the mill, parked near the back gate, and waited. When Daniel clocked out at 11:34, Marcus followed him in the Nova. Daniel drove his normal route. A few miles down Hendersonville Road, Marcus flashed his headlights and honked. Daniel recognized the car and pulled over, probably confused about why Marcus had driven out to meet him. Marcus got out, walked up to Daniel's window. They talked for a minute. Then Marcus pulled a tire iron from behind his back and hit Daniel in the side of the head. Once, then twice more. Daniel collapsed against the steering wheel. Marcus panicked. He'd planned to make it look like Daniel left town, abandoned his truck somewhere. But now there was blood on the seat, blood on Daniel's shirt. Marcus dragged Daniel's body to his own car and drove to the logging road, someplace remote where nobody went at night. He drove Daniel's truck there with Daniel's body in the passenger seat, then positioned everything to make it look like Daniel had parked there himself. Marcus carried Daniel's body into the woods, about 200 yards, to a ravine he knew from hunting trips. He rolled the body down into the ravine, then covered it with leaves and branches. He made sure to take the tire iron with him, cleaned it later, threw it in a dumpster. Then Marcus drove his Nova back to the mill, went to the payphone, and called his own house. Lynn answered. He told her to say they'd been home together all night if anyone asked. She agreed. She didn't know why, not until later. When she finally understood what he'd done, she was too scared to tell anyone. Scared of Marcus, scared of being implicated, scared of losing everything. Marcus drove home. He cleaned the blood from his car. He went to bed. The next morning, when Patricia called asking about Daniel, Marcus acted surprised, concerned, helpful. He spent the next 39 years pretending to be the loyal friend, searching for the man he'd killed. In November 2021, Marcus Webb led police to the ravine in the Pisgah National Forest. It took 3 days of searching, but they found the remains. Bones scattered by animals over nearly 4 decades, but enough left to confirm through DNA. Daniel Reeves had been there all along, less than a quarter mile from where his truck had been found. The trial began in April 2022. Patricia Reeves, now 84 years old, sat in the front row every day. She'd waited 40 years for this. Lynn Webb testified against her husband, having been granted immunity in exchange for her truthful testimony. She cried on the stand, said she'd lived with the guilt every day. said she should have spoken up in 1982, but was too afraid. Marcus's defense tried to argue that the DNA could have been transferred innocently, that the confession was coerced, that there wasn't enough physical evidence to prove murder after so much time. But the jury didn't believe it. The timeline was too clear. The lies were too obvious. The hair found in the truck, combined with the phone records and Lynn's testimony, was enough. On June 15, 2022, Marcus Webb was convicted of second-degree murder. The judge sentenced him to 30 years in prison. At 63, it was likely a life sentence. Patricia Reeves spoke at the sentencing. She stood at the podium, frail but steady, and looked directly at Marcus Webb. She said she'd trusted him. She said he'd sat in her kitchen hundreds of times over the years, drinking her coffee, looking her in the eye, lying. She said she didn't forgive him, would never forgive him. She said she hoped he'd spend every day in prison thinking about Daniel, about the life he'd stolen, about the 40 years of grief he'd caused. Marcus Webb said nothing. He was led away in handcuffs. Daniel Reeves was buried in October 2022, exactly 40 years after he disappeared. The funeral was attended by nearly 200 people, many who'd never known him, but who'd followed the case in the news. Patricia stood beside the grave, one hand on the polished wood of the casket, and said goodbye to her son. Detective Sarah Chen attended the funeral. Afterward, Patricia found her in the parking lot and hugged her. "Thank you," Patricia said. "Thank you for not giving up." Chen drove back to Asheville that evening, thinking about the case. One hair, trapped in a door seal. That's all it took. One piece of evidence, preserved for 39 years, waiting for technology to catch up. The case file for Daniel Reeves was officially closed on November 1st, 2022. Chen wrote the final report, documenting everything from the original disappearance to the DNA breakthrough to the conviction. The file was archived, marked solved, and stored in the basement of the Asheville Police Department. But Chen made sure to add one final note. This case demonstrates the importance of preserving all evidence, no matter how insignificant it may seem at the time. What couldn't be analyzed in 1982 became the key to justice in 2021. We cannot predict what technology will be available in the future, but we can ensure that evidence survives long enough to matter. The woods of western North Carolina are still wild, still capable of keeping secrets. But sometimes, if you're patient, if you refuse to accept the easy answers, the truth finds its way back out of the darkness. Daniel Reeves is home now, and Marcus Webb is exactly where he belongs. The story of Daniel Reeves isn't just about murder. It's about betrayal, about the corrosive power of pride, and about how technology can finally give voice to those who can no longer speak for themselves. In 1982, a single hair meant nothing. There was no way to analyze it, no database to compare it against, no method to extract the truth it held. But investigators collected it anyway, labeled it, stored it, believing that someday it might matter. That faith in the future of justice is what makes this case so significant. In an era where evidence is often digital, where everything seems temporary and erasable, the Daniel Reeves case reminds us that physical evidence endures. A hair, a fiber, a single cell containing DNA, these tiny fragments can wait decades for their moment to speak. Marcus Webb's betrayal was especially cruel because of its length. He didn't just kill his friend. He spent 40 years pretending to grieve, inserting himself into Patricia's suffering, presenting himself as the loyal companion searching for answers. That level of deception requires a coldness that's hard to comprehend. Every time he sat in Patricia's kitchen, every time he helped post flyers, every time he shook his head sadly and said he wished he knew what happened. He was actively participating in a lie he'd created. The case also reveals something about how murders are solved. Despite everything we see on television, most homicides aren't solved through brilliant deduction or dramatic confrontations. They're solved through patience, through careful preservation of evidence, and through investigators who refuse to accept incomplete answers. Sarah Chen didn't crack the case through genius. She cracked it by being thorough, by using new tools, and by questioning assumptions that had been accepted for decades. For Patricia Reeves, the resolution brought both closure and renewed grief. She finally knew what happened to her son, could finally bury him, could finally stop wondering if he might still be alive somewhere. But she also had to confront the fact that someone she'd trusted, someone she'd considered almost family, had murdered Daniel and then lied to her face for 40 years. That betrayal, on top of the original loss, was its own kind of torture. The Daniel Reeves case now serves as a teaching example in law enforcement circles. It's studied in cold case units across the country as evidence of what's possible when DNA technology meets careful evidence preservation. The hair found in Daniel's truck had been collected by a forensic tech in 1982 who didn't know what it might someday prove, but who followed protocol and made sure it was properly stored. That unknown forensic technician's attention to detail, nearly 4 decades earlier, made justice possible. In Asheville today, there's a small memorial in Montford neighborhood, not far from where Patricia Reeves lived. It's a simple stone with Daniel's name, his dates, and a single line. Lost but not forgotten, found through perseverance. The memorial was funded by donations from people who followed the case, who were moved by Patricia's decades of searching, who wanted to honor both Daniel and his mother's refusal to give up. Patricia Reeves passed away in December 2023, 18 months after Daniel's funeral. She was 85. In her final weeks, she told friends she was ready to go, that she'd done what she needed to do. She'd seen justice for her son. She'd been able to say goodbye properly. She could rest now. At her funeral, Detective Sarah Chen spoke briefly. She said Patricia had taught her something important about why cold cases matter. "These aren't just files," Chen said. "They're people. They're mothers who wait. They're questions that deserve answers. Patricia Reeves waited 40 years for the truth. We owed her that truth, no matter how long it took to find." The case file sits in the archives now, marked solved, but it remains active in another way. It's used in training sessions for new detectives, shown as an example of how to approach cold cases with fresh eyes. The DNA evidence is still preserved, stored according to modern protocols, available for any future legal proceedings. And somewhere in the Pisgah National Forest, the ravine where Daniel's body lay for nearly 40 years, is marked on topographical maps used by the Buncombe County Sheriff's Department. It's a reminder of what the woods witnessed and of what they eventually revealed. The mountains keep secrets, but not forever. Time and technology and determined investigators eventually pry those secrets loose. Daniel Reeves's case proved that. A single hair, collected in 1982, analyzed in 2021, telling a story that had been hidden for 39 years. The truth waited. And when the moment came, when the technology caught up, when the right investigator asked the right questions, that truth emerged. Marcus Webb is serving his sentence at a medium security facility in central North Carolina. He'll be 93 years old if he lives to see parole eligibility. He gives no interviews, accepts no visitors, except his attorney. Lynn Webb divorced him before the trial concluded and moved out of state. Their children have not spoken publicly about their father's crime. In the evidence room at the Asheville Police Department, There are dozens of other cold case boxes, each containing items collected decades ago, waiting for their turn. Hairs, fibers, bloodstains, cigarette butts, each one potentially holding a truth that current technology can't yet access, but future technology might. Detective Sarah Chen continues to work cold cases. She's currently reviewing 7 other files from the 1980s and 1990s, looking for similar opportunities where preserved DNA might finally yield answers. She thinks about Daniel Reeves often, uses his case as motivation when investigations seem hopeless. If we'd thrown away that hair in 1985 or 1995 or 2005, Chen said in a recent interview, Marcus Webb would have gotten away with murder. The only reason justice happened is because someone in 1982 did their job properly and preserved evidence, even though they had no idea what that evidence might someday prove. That's the legacy of the Daniel Reeves case. Not just that a killer was caught, but that the case demonstrates the cumulative power of careful work, proper procedure, and faith that justice, even when delayed, can still arrive. The evening Daniel disappeared, October 14, 1982, was unremarkable in most ways. Across Asheville, people went about their normal Thursday night routines. They watched television, did dishes, put children to bed. Most of them never heard about the young man who'd vanished from a mill parking lot, whose truck would be found in the woods, whose body would lie hidden for 40 years. But for Patricia Reeves, that evening marked the beginning of a 4-decade wait. And for Marcus Webb, it marked the beginning of a lie he'd maintain until DNA finally exposed the truth. The story reminds us that every cold case represents someone waiting. A mother, a sibling, a friend, someone who deserves to know what happened, who deserves to see justice done, no matter how long it takes. And it reminds us that evidence speaks, but only if we preserve it long enough to hear what it has to say. Daniel Reeves's voice was silenced in 1982, but in 2021, through the miracle of modern forensic science and the determination of investigators who refused to let his case remain forgotten, that voice was finally heard. The mountains of western North Carolina are still wild, still beautiful, still capable of hiding what happened in their shadows. But they're also, eventually, capable of revelation. And in a small cemetery in Asheville, under a stone that reads, Daniel James Reeves, 1959-1982, rest in peace. A young man finally rests in ground, blessed by truth, surrounded by people who never stopped searching, watched over by a mother who waited 40 years to bring him home,